Hi, everyone. On behalf of the NYU Center for Cybersecurity and on behalf of the NYU Journal for Legislation and Public Policy, I'd love to welcome you to our event on deepfakes in the law. My name is Danielle Shulkin. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal, and we've been thinking about this topic for a long time, partly because in some ways it's not new. Rumor, for example, is probably one of the earliest versions of misinformation campaigns, and the harms from rumors are very well documented throughout history. But today we're here to talk about a new development, and without further ado, I just want to introduce our keynote speaker, who is certainly an expert on the subject. Katherine Harrison is the CEO and founder of the Deep Trust Alliance, which is a nonprofit, multi-industry organization dedicated to combating misinformation campaigns, as well as setting standards in which to combat misinformation campaigns. And before she created the Deep Trust Alliance, she spent a decade at IBM in many different roles and in many different positions, but most recently she was the director of global product management of the IBM blockchain platform. And she's a member of many other organizations. She's got lots of fun facts. She's a council member at the Council of Foreign Relations. She's an ultra-marathon runner. And she also just got into the New York City Marathon, so congratulations. And fun fact, there's actually a number of women in particular who are triathletes and marathoners who you'll be hearing from today. So I am personally very inspired, though not up to that level. And without further ado, I'd love to help introduce Katherine Harrison to the stage. Thank you.
Great. Let's see. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much to NYU Law and the Center for Legislation and Public Policy, as well as the Center for Cybersecurity. I am delighted to be here. As was explained, I run the Deep Trust Alliance, which is a membership organization which is working to convene stakeholders, build solutions, and drive awareness and adoption of the problems of malicious deepfakes and disinformation. So I have the unique pleasure of starting off this incredible day, 9:20 on a Monday. That is a tough spot to start in. So I'm gonna wake you up and get your attention. Let's start with a little game that I like to play. It's called Two Truths and a Lie. This is the audience participation part before we get to Q&A. So I'm gonna make 3 statements, and I want you guys to tell me which one is the lie. So the first statement: the number of deep fakes that was identified on the open internet last year more than doubled from 2018. Statement number 2, 96% of those deep fakes are deep fake porn, generally of women whose consent was not gotten. Number 3, the number of forensics researchers working on this problem relative to the number of video synthesis researchers is 100 to 1. So, who thinks that the first statement is the lie? Nobody? Okay. We got one. It is in fact a truth. Well, actually, I shouldn't tell you that because now I'm going to ruin the game. Shoot. More coffee. Anyway, who thinks the second statement is the lie? We have a couple hands, okay? And who thinks the third statement is the lie? Oh, good. You guys have done your homework. That is correct. The third statement, there are actually 100 video synthesis researchers for every 1 forensics researcher. We talk about this as an arms race, and the odds are certainly stacked in the favor of the creation of these technologies rather than the detection of them. So now that you're awake, now that I've got you paying attention, we're going to talk a little bit about what deep fakes are and how they fit into the broader landscape of misinformation and disinformation. Much like this image, which is not a deep fake, deep fakes are only part of the problem. But I would argue that deep fakes are awesome because for the first time in history, they've captured the imagination of the broad population as it relates to misinformation and disinformation. And that's really, really important. So let's jump into some definitions. So I want to start by thinking about the categories of information. What's really important when we think about this space is the role of falseness and the intent to harm. I'm not even going to touch the term fake news because that is a term that has been politicized to mean anything that someone in power doesn't agree with. So I want to start with these categories of information because they're really critical to understanding the landscape. So first and foremost, there is probably the broadest category, which is misinformation. That is information that is incorrect. Does not necessarily mean that it was intentionally put out there, but it is incorrect, either in the wrong context, the wrong time, etc. On the other side, we have true information, which is used with an intention to harm. So that could be the release of private information in order to harm an individual. That could be taking true information and putting it in a false context. And at the intersection of those two, we find disinformation. This is false information which is created with an intent to harm or to change the perception of reality and truth. So there are many, many, many ways in which to drive misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. We could spend an entire day talking about those categories and all of the different techniques. But I'm going to focus on two broad sets of manipulations: cheap fakes and deep fakes. Now, I'm using this shorthand because it's catchy. And cheap fakes, this is the Nancy Pelosi video which came out last summer. This represents any type of editing or manipulation that is used, that is created using tools that have existed for the last 100+ years. This could be cropping, editing, resizing. This is not necessarily using artificial intelligence in order to create a manipulation. Cheap fakes today are by far the biggest and most important problem that we have to face on the open internet. So this is an incredible topic, but it's really important as we think about deep fakes and all of the possibilities, we don't lose sight that that is just one narrow set of problems within the disinformation space. Next, we're going to get into deep fakes. And I'm going to run through a couple of examples just to make sure that everybody has a sense for what deep fakes look like. Before I do that, I want to share a couple of key terms that I think are really helpful and that you will likely hear throughout the day. At the heart of how a deep fake works is a machine learning technology called generative adversarial networks, GANs for short. Anyone who's been in this space for a long time throws that word about like it means, something that's very obvious to everyone, and I want to make sure that we all understand. I've included a very simple example here to give you a sense of how generative adversarial networks work. So, you can imagine a counterfeiter. A counterfeiter is a generator. They are trying to create fake money that looks as close to real as possible. So in a GAN, you have a generator that is constantly generating new images, trying to get them as close to real as possible. On the other hand, you have the discriminator, who is comparing those generated or fake images against real data sets. And they are discriminating and helping the generator network get better and better until you get to a point at which the discriminator can no longer tell the difference between the counterfeit and the real. So this is a very simplified overview, but it gives you a sense of you basically create competition between machine learning algorithms in order to get better and better images and video. So what does this look like? There are a few key types of deep fakes that I want to share with you. We're going to try and pull up a couple of short clips just to give you a quick sense. So let's go here. Ooh. Can we turn up the volume?
Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
So this is a video from, obviously taken from Space Odyssey. Elon Musk, along with Nicolas Cage, are two of the perennial favorites for face swaps. Ooh, let me go back. Perhaps not surprisingly. I like this video because, if I can pull it back up, you get some really interesting light and shadow on his face. Elon Musk's face has obviously been transposed onto the original actors, and it looks quite convincing if you aren't aware of what the original film looked like. So that's the first one. Nicolas Cage is one of the other very popular figures in face swaps. Let's maximize that. Ooh, hold on one second. All right. The second are lip sync videos. So generally what happens here is you take video of an existing figure. Very often these are celebrities and public figures like Obama. This is one of the more famous ones. And you can actually use this technology in order to have them say things that they have never said before in their lives. So for those of you who, let's have a quick look.
Make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit.
Fascinating. It's not just video, however. GAN technology can be used to alter audio as well. I have to thank Corin Fife from Witness, who is going to be speaking later today. He shared this at an event that we spoke at last week, and I loved it. One more round of audience participation. This is a company called Dessa, and they create fake audio. Who is familiar with Joe Rogan? Oh, good. Excellent. So we are going to play a little game. We're going to try and determine which is fake and which is real. We'll do two of these to have a little check.
Jerky, some of it has some sugar in it, folks. I can definitely tell.
Think it's real or do you think it's fake? Who thinks it's real? Okay, so the audience thinks it's fake. Let's see. Nope, that was real. Let's do one more.
What was the person thinking when they discovered cow's milk was fine for human consumption? And why did they do it in the first place?
Who thinks it's real? We've only got 3. Everybody else thinks it's fake, is that right? Okay. You were right. Good job, guys. I won't spend too much time going through the rest of those, but it shows you how hard it can be to find the differences. This actually led to a theft of almost $250,000 from a German CEO whose voice was hacked using existing voice technology tools last year. Finally, this one is quite fun. This is real-time reenactment. So what you can do is you can take a video of someone and you can actually change specific words or expressions in their face that they are saying. So let's share one more of these. This is a German team that has worked on this.
Here we show a close-up of the footage from a previous live reenactment. The input video stream is shown on the left. Note that the target actor is re-rendered in a neutral pose. On the right, we can see the final output of our method.
So as you can see, not only can you make Obama say things he would never say, you can make George Bush make funny faces. These are not the only types of deepfakes. There are now new technologies which enable you to actually type in text and generate videos out of that text. You can do full body replacement. This technology is improving and increasing at a rate and pace which has rarely been seen before. So at least that gives you a good overview of some of the different types of deep fakes. So what are the threats? I mean, most of this looks like a lot of fun. Many of these are used for entertainment, for satire, for communication. There certainly are plenty of benefits to that, no? So I want to talk about 4 threats. The first is the liar's dividend. Does anyone know who this is? Who is in this photo? It's Ali Bongo Ondimba. He's the president of Gabon. I'm going to tell you a short story. So in 2018, he was very ill and out of the public eye for quite some time. He was getting treatment in Saudi Arabia for what was unclear to the wide public, but it was said that it was a stroke. On New Year's Eve, 2018, so December 31st, 2018, he released this video offering a New Year's message to the people of Gabon. This video has been reviewed extensively by numerous forensics teams. And it has been shown that it was not created with AI technology. However, the very existence of this technology led Bongo's opponents to claim that this was a deep fake, that the president was dead or incapacitated, and that the government was trying to retain control. The liar's dividend is the fact that this technology exists means that anyone who is unhappy with any information that might get put out into the public sphere can introduce doubt about its veracity. So whether the information is true or not, someone can very effectively claim that's fake news, it's not real, you can't believe it. And this is by far the most fundamental threat to our society because it raises a level of skepticism where we can no longer know who to trust, what to trust, and what are the foundational truths in our society. This ultimately shakes the core of any democracy. But that's not it. It's not just democratic ideals, elections, our belief in our institutions. It's also our economy. In 2013, a full year before Ian Goodfellow first wrote the first paper describing generative adversarial networks, a team of Syrians hacked into the Associated Press's Twitter account. Looking to cause trouble, they posted a tweet basically saying that there were explosions in the White House and that Barack Obama had been injured. That sent the S&P plummeting. It lost 26% of its value in a series of seconds. Given the way in which algorithmic trading works right now, all you have to do is move social sentiment on social media networks for a period of less than 3 minutes in order to trigger many of the algorithmic trading mechanisms to kick in and provide massive swings in the market. Now, the government stepped in very quickly to clarify that this was not correct, that this was false information, and the markets regained their position. However, if you had been short the S&P 500 at this exact moment, you would have made a lot of money. And so there is an incredible opportunity to attack corporate executives, products, and companies with false information. The third set of threats refers to social engineering. So we're all familiar with phishing attacks, with business email compromise, but with new technologies like deep fakes, you can now start to very quickly misrepresent and impersonate individuals through facial recognition, voice authentication, etc., making it much easier to take over people's accounts, take over access to their personal identity, funds, etc. Finally, there's another and more pernicious harm than I think the last two, and that's extortion and harassment. Does anyone know who this woman is? Yep. Go ahead, who is it? That's right. So this is Rana Ayub. She's a journalist in India who has been incredibly critical of Prime Minister Modi. Her face was transposed onto a pornographic video and was transmitted through multiple WhatsApp groups all across India. Obviously, deepfake porn is a huge problem regardless of where it happens, but in India, it had very real consequences, including death threats and attacks to her life. She took this video to the police and asked for their help to get it taken down or dealt with. Unfortunately, the police looked at her, they watched the video with her, they mocked her, told her that she deserved to have this kind of content made about her, and it took the United Nations to intervene in order for the video to begin to be taken down and dealt with. Imagine if this was your teenage daughter who said the wrong thing to the wrong person at school. How would you react? What would you do to get that content taken down? There are things that can't be measured in dollars and cents that this set of threats poses to individuals, organizations, and societies at large. So what does it take to tackle the threat of deepfakes? And why do we need to do this now? So if we think about generative adversarial networks, it takes 3 key things to make a deep fake. One is processing power, and that is now accessible at a rate and pace that was never possible before. Second, it takes machine learning algorithms, many of which are now available open source. And finally, it takes data sets. And the internet platforms, which we all are part of, now provide access to more and more data than has ever been possible before. So as this technology becomes democratized, as the internet drives the speed and the scale at which this content can reach, we need to be really thoughtful as a society about how we respond and how we react. And I think we're at a really important moment, because while this technology is growing very rapidly, it's still nascent enough to be able to create norms and best practices to mitigate some of its most pernicious effects. So I'm going to argue that first and foremost, we need to build coalitions of stakeholders. All of you in this room are an excellent example of what it takes to start. No single entity can solve this by themselves. It takes private industry, it takes government, it takes civil society, and it takes academia to understand the threat, define the solutions, and implement them. It's going to take technology. There are obviously challenges that can be overcome by being able to identify the provenance of content, detect it, and slow or stop its distribution. But technology is a little bit too easy. It's not sufficient to solve this problem because ultimately we're dealing with hardware, software, and humans, and the humans are by far the hardest part of the equation. So as we're going to talk about today, we need to think about policy. Now, this is not just government policy, though there is certainly room for government policy. Individual organizations and groups of stakeholders need to come together to set standards, to set best practices, to build a culture of norms around how this content is dealt with. And then we need to deal with education. And I'm not just talking about media literacy or education for children. People over the age of 65 spread misinformation 7 times more than any other group. We need to think about how do we tackle this problem across our entire society. What are the human-centered design points that we can put into the tools and technologies that we use that make it much easier to understand for people of all levels of sophistication and expertise as it relates to digital tools? And I want to challenge you all to think about the life cycle of information. Camille Francois, who's at a company called Graphica, talks about the ABCs of disinformation: the actors, the behaviors, and the content. And here I lay out the 5 key phases in creating information. You have the individuals and the organizations who are creating disinformation. Who are they and what are the incentives? Why do they want to create this information? Is it simply for entertainment, satire, and parody? Or is it to make money, change the perception, or harm specific individuals? Next, you have the phase of creation. How do you actually create this content? What tools are used, and how can you identify what edits have been made? The third piece is distribution. If I sit in my apartment and I make thousands of memes, thousands of deep fakes, but they never leave my laptop, that doesn't really matter. The problem is the extent to which they then get out across the internet to deceive and harm other individuals. So we need to think about what are the distribution mechanisms, how are they identified, and how do they reach scale? And then once I get those memes out onto the internet, the next question is, how believable are they? If it's very clear that they're fake or that they don't have any bearing in reality, that's a very different impact than if they are very credible and suddenly start to change people's opinions. And then finally, we must consider the impacts. What are the harms on individuals, on organizations, and on society? So we have an incredible lineup of panels and speakers who are on the front lines of this conversation and building solutions. I would suggest, as you listen to these panels, you think about a couple of key questions. So first and foremost, we're going to hear about fake news, technology, and big data. I'd really think and ask questions about how are those stakeholders coming together? How are they dealing with the incentives to create misinformation and disinformation? And how are they measuring what success looks like for the interventions and the mitigations that they are implementing? Later, we're going to hear about some of the policy proposals. I'd suggest you think about what existing laws, whether it be copyright, defamation, libel, can we use to already begin to deal with some of these threats? And where do they need to be updated and extended to address the harm and the reach that deep fakes can cause? The second thing is I would look at the unintended consequences. How are marginalized populations, part of this conversation, likely to be impacted or harmed in different ways through the use of deep fakes. So I am thrilled that I've gotten a chance to start this conversation with all of you. I'm looking forward to a set of incredible conversations over the next couple of hours. And just want to thank you and enjoy the day. Thanks. Yeah. Do we have 5 minutes for questions? Yeah. And I think we have 5 minutes if you guys want to ask me questions. Go ahead.
Isn't the flip side of the liar's dividend that we eventually become so skeptical and nervous of this that they lose their impact?
So that is one of the potential flip sides, and that might not be the end of the world if we all come with an expectation of zero truth. However, we're living in a world today where for the last 100 years, because of the difficulty of creating credible fakes, processing power was very expensive, the technology to create them was only available to Hollywood studios or to sovereign governments. Humans, by default today, trust what they see. Because for the last 100 years, that's been the default. You've been able to trust. So we have a ways to go before, whether that's the ultimate conclusion or not, we have a very important period that we're entering where lots of people are unsure of what they're looking at and don't necessarily have the tools or the skills to decipher it. If you were to ask me what I think the key risk in the 2020 election is, I would say it's not deep fakes. It's actually going to be a true video that will pop up in late October that we won't be able to prove is true or false. And someone will be able to very quickly discredit it, and the election will be too close behind to actually understand what we've seen and how that impacts the particular candidate or issue. Any other questions? Yep, go ahead.
You mentioned that believability is an important part of whether a deepfake is actually important or not. My question for you is, how often is believability not important? Meaning, some people will see something that they know is a joke, but they forward it anyways, saying, "Hey, this advances what I want, even though I can see it's fake." And then gradually that line gets crossed to, okay, now I'm more interested in things that look fake. Meaning the point is not that it was believable at first, but that it tells a story and gets people to believe that this could be true anyways.
Yeah, humans love misinformation, disinformation, anything that's false or outrageous. And so I think there's kind of two sides of the believability coin. There are actors who are truly trying to create fake content to change your perception or to change your understanding of reality, and they are really focused on believability. On the flip side, everyone has their existing biases, and very often, especially given the amount of time that we spend on any individual website, photo, video, etc., all they have to do is be close enough to your existing value proposition or value set of beliefs for you to want to share and to put that out into the world. And so I do think it's important that we continue to understand, is this believable or not? But that's also why education and norm setting is critical. Because right now we have a norm where you share whatever is the craziest or coolest thing you've ever seen. And we need to start thinking about what do we actually share and what do we hold back. Much in the way that certainly these days with coronavirus, you wash your hands every time you go to the bathroom. You may not think about whether you're actually going to, get germs that are going to cause some disease, but you certainly don't want anybody else in the bathroom to see you not washing your hands. We need to get to similar types of norms and similar types of behaviors in the digital world. One more question, or? Okay, great. Well, thank you guys. Enjoy your day.